Okay, so we're going to get started. And this is going to be the last session in this room, actually. After this session, there'll be some closing remarks. And so we have Dr. Marcus Hanwell, and he's the technical leader at the program, and he's going to do an awesome presentation on saving time.
So this is similar to a talk I gave at TEDx Albany. It's quite different to the normal talks I give, where instead of the drier scientific presentations and software development, I'm talking more about motivation and how I got to where I got as a physicist who was actually aiming to be a scientist in the beginning and then became a software developer. And one of the things I noticed as I got older is your motivations change a little as you progress in life and you have children, and you get different perspectives as you move through things. And really, when I first got into science, I realized it was all about standing on the shoulders of giants. And when I was working in open source and I got my first little tastes of open source, I was often told that open source is inspired by science and standing on those shoulders of giants and having principles and things like peer review. But what I began to realize as I moved into my PhD was that science itself was losing sight of some of those early founding principles. Instead of standing on the shoulders of the previous giants, more and more was becoming hidden, less and less was published, and when it was published, it was often more obscure than it needed to be. And as we moved into a more computationally oriented age, we've seen more and more proprietary codes, more and more closed formats. And we were actually less and less able, even the computational sides of simulation and measurement, where all the data is recorded by computer, we were not sharing those raw results. We weren't really sharing all the methodology. We were sharing lots of black boxes. If you go right back to 1660, one of the earliest societies, the Royal Society, had the motto of nullius and verba, which is take nobody's word for it, roughly translated. And it was really one of the founding principles of science. You can make an assertion, you can claim a hypothesis is true, but then the burden of proof is on you as a scientist to really explain why that is true, publish the methodology. Often you would publish the mathematical equations and the derivations so that others could come along after you and they could rederive that equation, they could see if that equation is valid, they could look at your data tables and then they could try to reproduce those. And the Royal Society actually employed people whose job was to reproduce experiments. And when you published a paper with them, they would publish these experiments. And back then, the most rapid way of publishing your research was using the printing press. You could rapidly produce many copies and they could be shipped around the world. It took a while. I mean, it was on the order of weeks, but information relatively could be disseminated very quickly using what we now call the journal article. And we've stuck with the journal article for many, many years, and it's become more of a weight around our necks in recent years because it's not expressive enough. And it often hides a lot of the underlying details that are more easily shared using this newfangled thing which was actually invented to help facilitate science called the internet. And the internet allows very rapid dissemination of information and allows us to really share this very quickly. But one of the things that's happened to science is trust was always there, but verification was expected. But as we move forward, there was less and less verification and more trust, especially if it was published in a large journal. So I have a PhD in physics. It's what many say is one of the harder sciences. And if I have a PhD from a good university, especially if I publish in a well-known journal, surely my results must be true. You've got to trust them because I'm Dr. Hanwell and I have a PhD in physics. I've been blessed by my university with that accreditation. I worked hard for it, and then I published in something maybe Science, Nature, and really the verification has just dropped off to endemic levels where it's becoming impossible to stand on those shoulders of giants because the foundations are crumbling below us. There isn't enough verification, and there's not enough that's really known. And then there's a funny tendency as you become a PhD to learn how to say things so that it sounds like you did a good job, and you want to sound intelligent, you want to sound trustworthy. And so you're not exactly dishonest, but you do need to maybe decipher some of the phrases that are used in typical academic papers. And this is Jorge Chan, probably got his name entirely wrong, but PhD Comics is a very, very entertaining and very insightful view into the world of a PhD scientist and what it takes to learn how to be a scientist, talk to scientists, and then when you're reading papers, yeah, how do you decipher, like, future work will focus on, whereas, yeah, we know there are some really big flaws that we promise, if you accept this paper, we'll get to them, we'll figure it out, and we'll tell you the rest of the story. Well, remains an open question, actually one of my favorites. It's, we really have no clue, but it's much better to say, this remains an open question, and it's up to you, the reader, to maybe explore this. Another one in derivations, if you get lost in the middle, you can just say, well, it can be shown that, and then you just skip 5 or 6 steps, and if you're intelligent enough, you'll get there, I'm sure. But reproducibility is such an important aspect of science, and this is where I think, as a physicist, you've got to love the symmetry, where open source is inspired by practices in science. And now, I think, as we go forward, it's important for science to really kind of fold those practices back in, learn from the age of the internet, learn from things like open source, rapid sharing, peer review. These are all things that they originally came from the scientific practice, but now they're done far less efficiently because they haven't adapted to all the new technology that's been developed. CERN was one of the drivers behind the internet, but we still publish PDFs, and the PDFs are paginated. And they publish tables of data, but I can't often download the actual raw data to reprocess it. And they will often say, I put it into this black box. It's called my software blah, it's a commercial product, or it's maybe a product we developed in a lab. And it gave me this answer, and I've got this nice line, so it's a good relationship and you should trust it. But they don't often really go and publish the actual code that they're using. And more, because we're getting more data, we're having to write code just to do things like analysis, data reduction, but we're not necessarily sharing that code. And a lot of that is the elitism that's seen in PhD programs where you don't want to be seen to be wrong, you want to seem to be an expert. And so you often don't want to share this code, not because you really even think there's value in it, but because you don't want to share something that isn't perfect. And I've gone to many meetings with some really great scientists in both open source settings and more academic settings. And it's an amazing thing to see someone from a very good university standing up in front of you and saying, I don't really think I've been able to sell this code, but I don't want to share it because someone might look at it and see that it's wrong. And my answer to that is, exactly, you want to share it, and they may point out that it's wrong. And then they will tell you, and they will hopefully improve it, and they will contribute it back. And we can get back to actually standing on the shoulders of these giants that came before us. And I think that's really things like the Mechanical Turk. I don't know if you know the story of this, but many, many years ago, I'm trying to remember the century because I suck at history, but 17th, 18th century, it was claimed that a Mechanical Turk had been invented. So we had an automaton, and it could play chess, and it could beat you at chess. And these people went around town to town, and people paid to play against this Mechanical Turk. And if you look, right in there's a small seat. And a small person who was reasonably good at chess, he would sit there, and they would close that door, and he would hide. And the person above would sit, and they would play chess, and they would see the move that was made in response to their move. And as far as they were concerned, this was a mechanical automaton that was able to understand and play chess. And it was actually a small person hiding in here, and it was a ruse to make money from the invention of something that had not yet been invented. We later went on to invent programs that could play chess, and it was many centuries later than these beautiful machines. And I believe you can see a few of these in different museums. And it's because we couldn't see inside those boxes until people uncovered this fraud. And this is one of the problems that's hitting science in various areas. There's such a pressure to publish, and we're not necessarily showing all of the working, and there have been some great scandals that have come about over the years. So really, I think we need to get back to showing what is inside the box and giving people everything they actually need to reproduce the results. So things like the raw data. We also need to agree, because the data is growing, how do we share that data? What format should we use? And how should data be stored? And how many years do we guarantee the data will be available? Especially when we're talking about, in some cases, petabytes of data. there are still serious problems, even if we all agree we want to share, and how we do that. And some of the funding agencies are thinking very carefully about this now. But once we have the data, we need to actually then understand how do we run the calculations, how do we do the analysis. And this often involves custom source code, or it might be scripts that run inside of the packages, and they're really not shared very often. And when you think back to when you were taught at school, I was taught that I got most of my marks for showing my working. But as we go into PhDs and into research in general, the impetus to show your working is actually a negative impetus often, because you don't want people to spot mistakes. And there's this general feeling that if I show too much, that people may see the flaws in what I did. And I can just show the summary that shows the overall result. And I can give you a few examples, but I think this is a great quote from Brian Steele, where he's saying, in his opinion, and I strongly agree, that publishing research without data is simply advertising. It's not actual science. You're not telling me how you got there. You're not helping me to follow along in those steps. And so really, are we just wanting scientific publishing to become more about vanity and about getting jobs rather than progressing and actually sharing our knowledge with others? I think that really goes back to reproducibility, but it also goes back to how do we teach scientists about the basics of copyright. How do you share your data? If you have data you want to share, do you need a license? Many scientists don't think that's totally necessary, and if it is, what license should they choose? What are the implications? And one of the big movements right now is to move towards open access. But there's so much debate over, if I publish CC BY, does that mean people can put words into my mouth, or can they reuse my research but not give me credit? And these are all things that to me are amazingly obvious, but to many scientists they worry about if they don't use things like no derivatives and no commercial clauses, what will people do with their work? What will they make of it? And really, a lot of this is education. How do we teach people? CC BY is not something that gives anyone carte blanche to use your name and to change your research from underneath you. It's a way of sharing your research in a way that others can then remix it, they can augment it, they can build upon it. And the same with CC0, where we need these very low barriers. So if you have data, you can still get cited, and we can still assign things like DOIs. But you need to understand that we don't necessarily always need all the rights to be reserved. You don't need these ridiculous situations where some of my early papers I cannot access anymore. I have to ask friends in academia to access them. And if I ever adapt a table, I have to be careful to make sure I adapted enough, because the copyright is no longer mine. I signed it over to that journal. The journal didn't pay me any money to do that. I didn't receive any compensation. But the very act of publishing my work meant that I had to sign all copyright over. And many scientists are in a situation now where people like Elsevier are actually issuing takedown notices saying you may not post copies of your papers on your website because we own the copyright, and you cannot share these because they're ours. But that research has been paid by the NIH, the DOE, the NSF, and in Britain, EBSA. So most of the raw funding has come from these enormous agencies with millions of dollars, and they're doing this last little bit, and they're making some of the highest profit margins in the industry on work that is largely produced by scientists in academia and in many research labs across the world. And they're really just packaging these things up and putting them in PDFs and repositories. And they're not really adding as much value as they claim. And we can see that in many of the scandals that are coming out. As things like the recent austerity measures. And there was a student, and I believe he was doing a PhD, and this was just a class assignment to look at the paper and try to reproduce the results. The Excel spreadsheet wasn't shared because it was a typical journal article that didn't need to share a lot of the raw data. So he emailed the authors, and they kindly obliged, and they sent him a copy of the spreadsheet. And try as he might, he wasn't able to reproduce the shape of the curve. And then he spotted that there was actually a spreadsheet error. And these Harvard professors, who both had PhDs from prestigious universities, they worked at prestigious university, had made an error. And you've got whole countries making policy decisions, and they're not necessarily ever checking this result themselves, but they're changing the course of entire industries based on a mistake in an Excel spreadsheet that should have been shared in the first place, and it should have had more eyes on it before people started using it for these enormous policy decisions. So taking a step back, I mean, the open source people probably know this already, but for a scientist, this can be quite new. What really is open? And do we really need to put the word open in front of science? And that is possibly one of the greatest travesties of the modern age, is science was open from the start, but now we have to differentiate the new breed of science that's open again from the older breed that's become quite closed. But it really means everyone has the same access. So things like no commercial and not giving everyone the same access. Most universities still, even though they're non-profits, participate in what is generating profit by many definitions of the law. And so even universities often cannot use things that have no commercial clauses because they kick in. There was a recent case in Germany, I think last week, where they actually said that the no commercial clause for Creative Commons licenses is really limiting it just for personal use. You can't use it professionally in any way, shape or form. Whether you work in a non-profit, for-profit, anything in the middle. But you really need to guarantee there's certain basic rights for things like data, code, and also the methods that they have the right to share modifications. They can actually make these modifications and they're able to use them to produce new results. So one of the things that really blew me away was a recent study where only 6 out of 53 landmark cancer studies, these aren't just ones that were picked out of some journal that someone found, these are some of the biggest cancer studies that are out there. And they made an effort to actually reproduce all of these results. And for various reasons, only 6 of them could actually be reproduced out of 53. And that's quite a staggeringly low number. And I was amazed because these were some of the best articles out there, not just a random sampling. And so the reproducibility initiative was given $1.3 million to actually validate another 50 landmark cancer studies and to really go back and look at the foundations we're using to make decisions for future funding. Are they valid? Are the results really reproducible by other people in other labs? And has everything been published? And sometimes they'll go back and they will just small omissions in the methods section that didn't quite explain exactly how they apply the protocol. Other times, they may have been effectively choosing the best results, so they may not be representative, and a lot of scientists tend to be a little guilty of this, where you may work in the lab for 3 or 4 months, and you get some good results that show your hypothesis, and you tend to focus on those, and maybe you throw away 50 or 60 failures. And publishing a negative result in science is currently nearly impossible. So it can be very hard. I think I wasted around a month in my PhD trying to reproduce the use of a polymer to make monodispersed nanoparticles. So I received a vial of this polymer. I spent about a week in the lab, and then I spent a few days using a transmission electron microscope, and then another week trying to make them again because I assumed maybe I did it wrong. Then another few days. Well, it turned out really that this result was more of a one-off as far as we could tell, rather than a representative sample. It was a published paper in a peer-reviewed journal, and there wasn't really a good avenue for me to even publish that, other than to feed it back to the authors and say, really, this doesn't seem like it's having the desired effect. Because nanoparticles in general, you have many different sizes, and the dream is to make them all the same size because they have very different properties. So the paper itself was seen as a big step forward, but when you came to actually try and redo this in your own lab, it just wasn't able to reproduce it in a meaningful way in the time I had available. And I would put this back to, really, if you want to make beer, and I really enjoy making homebrew, use these 5-gallon bioreactors. And there's a lot of science involved. And you turn the sugar into sweet nectar, and you can really experiment with how you can make the beers taste better. And I discovered that if I sang to my beer, and as it fermented, it tasted better at the end. And I thought to myself, maybe it energizes the yeast. It makes the beer sweeter. And then I have graphs. I got my friends to taste it, and they agreed. I made two 5-gallon batches side by side, and I sang to one, I didn't sing to the other, and then I got my friends to taste it. And 9 out of 10 said, yeah, they preferred the stuff that I sang to. They even asked me what tunes I sang, whether I did it early in the morning, late at night. And I was able to go away and do a chemical analysis, and I showed that there were less esters. And esters are certain class of chemicals that they had a bit of an off flavour and that a lot of people don't like that flavour. And as you can see, there are quite a few steps when you make beer. It's a little bit of a complex process. So you have to go through a number of pieces where you ferment it, you transfer it, you bottle it, you bottle condition it. And so controlling for all of these can be a little tough, but I think I did a decent job. I'm a scientist. And do I really need to share much more? I sang to my beer, it tastes better, you should all sing to your beer. I think I'm finished. But if you go back and you take a look, and you think about it, it was actually in a cold part of my basement, because I didn't want to sit in the hot part of my basement and sing to my beer, because I'd get all sweaty and I'd feel uncomfortable. So I put the beer that I didn't sing to in the warmer part that wasn't necessarily as well air conditioned, but it was out of the way and it wouldn't hear the singing, so I wanted to control for the singing. And the yeast, when they're too hot, they produce more esters. This is actually scientifically understood. I didn't really sing to my beer. They needed to be in this control group. And it didn't matter if it got a little hotter over there. I mean, that was obviously inconsequential. But what I'm really trying to say here is, in big experiments, it can be very hard to control for all of the necessary parameters in effect the result of your experiment. And this might seem like a silly example in some ways, but it really is a good analogy to what happened in cold fusion experiments, where they were not controlling properly background neutron counts, and they thought that they'd discovered a way to induce cold fusion that would revolutionize the energy industry, but what they've really done is failed to fully account for the background radiation levels. And you've got to make a decision here. Do you want to sell beer, or do you want to do science? And if you wanted to sell beer, it's fine to keep trade secrets. You can have as many secrets as you wish. But if you want to package it up as science, you need to really publish everything you did and why you did it. And here I've got another where I think you can clearly see there's a nice linear relationship. So whatever these two parameters are, I hope most of you would agree they're probably related. I mean, this goes up as that progresses. This is the global average temperature along with the number of pirates, approximately. And we know that we need more pirates, otherwise the Earth is going to burn. So we need to thank the Somalians and all the others for keeping the pirate populations high. But what you really need to remember here is correlation does not equal causation. You need to make sure that you're actually thinking about your data and explaining why you came to the conclusions you came to, showing all that working. One thing I would assert as I've moved through my career is that computer code is quickly replacing mathematics as the language of science. So instead of showing me a derivation, you should be showing me the code that actually got you to that result. And here is one of the things I do in my day job. I spend a lot of time making pretty visualizations out of raw data. What I really do is I turn the data and the equations into code, and the code operates on the data. So you've got the main segments of my life are trying to have efficient implementations of mathematical equations, and then I often have to resort to numerical methods that can't even be fully expressed using simple analytical equations. And then I operate my data with the source code. And I turn it back into these pretty pictures. And this is localization of where the molecular orbitals are across the negative exponents. So you can understand the reactivity of a molecule, and you want to understand, will that molecule change or react in the presence of certain other molecules, or would it be a suitable material for solar cells, for example? Now I'd like to ask you, can you see the mistake in the code up here? You take a good look, prizes for anyone who can spot the mistake. I certainly had a lot of trouble, and this would reflect my experience. You spot the mistake? But I would say now, you still need someone who understands C++. But the code is transparent, you can see it, it's published. I forgot to initialize the double, so it's usually 0, and it will usually work, but it will occasionally have a value that then throws off a number. And this is perfectly analogous to what you get with closed source code, doing big science, versus an actual open box that someone can come along, they can examine, they can try and understand. The code really is an expression of mathematics, but you still need to have experts who are able to understand that code and then hopefully fix it and modify it and make it scale. And then we need the other components, such as open data, so we can reproduce what it did to the data. The source code, so you can actually examine this, modify it, and then share the modifications with others, and and show them how you were able to fix any problems we might have uncovered. You need the open standards so you're able to actually exchange this. So if you have different simulation packages, I think in computational chemistry we have 20, 30 plus simulation packages all effectively calculating similar things. But we don't actually have very good methods of comparing the outputs, and that's a big problem to me. I want to be able to compare what one code does to another and even use that for validation. Then we need open access, where people like me in industry, I became what a friend of mine terms scholarly poor. I cannot access most of the academic literature anymore. And I think that's really what science is all about. We're pushing the boundaries, and we're trying to really learn new things. If we don't have access to all the code, we often can't push those boundaries, and we come to a grinding halt. And it's not really about selling your ideas or promoting your work. It's about showing all of your work to others and having them tell you whether it works. And then you've got to look at, for academia, how do you go beyond impact factors and H-indexes? My own career, I have a terrible H-index, and I will probably never get an academic job unless I really up my game and make sure I get a larger H-index. And for those of you who don't know what that is, I think that's a great thing. But we need to reward academics for publishing code and data as well as for actually publishing papers. Papers are still certainly worthwhile, but there is far too much emphasis placed on them in the current system. I think if we get people involved in open source, we can actually produce degrees that have more skills that are actually relevant to industry. Because most people who do PhDs don't go on to become professors, they go on to do many other things. And I've found out that I'm far rarer than I ever realized. And there are not many scientists who really dug deep into coding and understanding data structures. But I want to be a part of making science open again, and this is what I do a lot in my spare time. And I think it's a very important endeavor, and we really need to push as hard as we can to make science open again, share as much as we can in the future, and help open source guide open science again. Thank you.
We have some time for questions.
First off, thanks for the presentation. Literally one of the best presentations I've ever seen.
Thank you.
I mean, it's very, very clear. I didn't realize just how important this kind of presentation is. I've been seeing the stuff you're talking about for years. And, I've been seeing this kind of stuff for years, and I have no answer to it at all. It's just extremely embedded in sort of the culture of science. And I think I'm sort of in a unique position as I have a master's degree, I don't have a PhD. I have fairly good software skills, and I'm not really a software guy. I have fairly good science skills, and I'm not a science guy. I'm about halfway in between. So maybe I'm 50 at each. There's not a lot of people who are 50 in each, but there's a lot of people who are 100 in one, really good in one or the other.
Yep.
And having that sort of crossover, I think, makes me aware of a lot more errors than some other people might see if they're really concentrating on one end or the other. But it's really, really difficult to, to convince people of this. And people are, as much openness as there is, people are still sort of surprisingly resistant to being open. Like, on this survey I followed, somebody shared some images. So worldwide listserv, very, very important problem, and said, hey, give me, do the best you can, give me some results. I was literally the only one in the world to apply for it. And that just sort of astounded me. Like, I'm nobody.
Yeah.
I'm not nobody, but I mean, I'm just one guy. There's people all over the place who know how to handle this problem. And my solution might be the worst out there. Who knows? But and there's why did nobody respond? And not just the fact that nobody responded, but kind of the fact that nobody was surprised that nobody responded. And the question was maybe one of the most important posts of the month, and it just got lost in all the shuffle. And it just sort of made me think, whoa, that's just doesn't make sense.
Yeah, I mean, this totally changed the course of my career because I saw so many problems in that area. And then as we tried to hire, I realized how few people go deep into both sides. It's generally very shallow in one or the other. it's definitely a problem, and I hope we can at least see that change over the next few years. And there are a lot of people trying to make this better in different domains, so I feel hopeful.
Yes, I was wondering, so you're saying here that scientists do not be open processes.
It varies by field, but yeah.
Varies, and some of the results not being useful in the cancer situation, 45 out of 50, or eating. You said the solution is to incentivize the openness?
I mean, I'd say that's part of the solution. So moving beyond page indexes and publications, to giving people credit for sharing their data and for sharing the methods that they use, the code they produce.
Could you elaborate on this a little bit more?
As I've seen it, as I've moved through my career and I've looked at others, the only real credit you get when you're trying to get tenure is your publication record. And I've seen some really great scientists who produce amazingly useful codes that are used by many people in their peer group. And they're actually penalized because they spend time maintaining that and helping support it. And it's the same with data, where it's better to hide the data so you can get as many publications out of it before you even think about sharing it. When you do share it, it's usually done in a very ad hoc way, which can really make it hard to understand even all the steps they took in analyzing. Like if you're segmenting out an organ, and then you wanted to look at cancer tumors, and you wanted to understand how you might automatically detect those, that may be deemed proprietary information. You can still publish a paper that doesn't tell you too much about exactly how the algorithm actually ran. It's more of a black box. So you say this answer is this, and then 20% of the time when you did the biopsy, it was a cancer, it wasn't benign. But the algorithm that is run is often not published. It's seen as, and then this makes it impossible for anyone else to follow afterwards, because you really want to be getting more publications out of it rather than sharing the code, because a lot of people worry then that they will lose the credit. They will never be given, if I write the library everyone else uses, will I ever get credit for that academically in any way? Or will I end up with the very low H indexes I have? I think I have 7 or something. And most people agree like 15 is minimum to go after a job in academia. So we need other things like altmetrics is one solution, where altmetrics looks at how many people talk about your papers. And then you've got F1000 is actually giving DOIs to data, so then people can cite the data, and then the academics can at least get academic credit for that, especially as the tenure committees change and they take notice of this. The same with GitHub. How many people have forked your project? How many people have started? That is ignored when I apply for proposals right now. But it's quite significant. We have over 500,000 downloads. So I'd say the project is significant, but it doesn't help you get funding.
Well, I think one of the ladies in the panel was saying something about that making people feel the pain of not. I'm not really a giant fan of having any pain in the world, but I'm guessing that the scientists don't really feel the pain. As you mentioned, those 2 Harvard professors from that year, and who knows how many people lost their jobs due to the austerity that was adopted. What happened to them? They still have their job?
Yeah, I think they still have a job. And it was a mistake. In science, mistakes happen. I think, to me, the take-home message is, if they'd shared that, it would have been spotted a lot sooner. And I wouldn't necessarily even want to fire them for it. I think we just need better peer review. And that should be part of the review process, even as you're looking at the article. They should have been able to see that. When I review a paper, no one gives me more data. I do this in my spare time. No one pays me to do it. And then the journal says, well, that'll be $35 for anyone who wants to access the article. Or you pay a massive subscription fee for academic institution, and then it's seen as a very indirect cost. But it's certainly a problem that they're not adding as much value as they should be in terms of the peer review. And then they're charging large amounts for access to this without really adding too much. It's my opinion, at least.
I worked for a private non-for-profit company where we had done an implementation of the program, and then there was before and after data, and an academic had done some analysis of it, and we got the results. And we actually did check them, and our code folks went through and took the results, which she after they asked her for them, she sent them, and they couldn't reproduce anything close to what she had come up with. So basically what had to be done was we gave up the idea that any of that was going to be published, and we, had to basically explain to the funder kind of, it didn't pan out, but it was mainly, just trying to like save face, but, and I think maybe to some extent, I don't know if it's more possible on in terms of, if you're working for a company or something insisting on seeing, if you're doing some kind of, especially if it's a grant funded kind of thing, but you're not you're working with the academic community, but you are an independent company from that. Maybe a non-for-profit.
I can definitely speak for that, because Kitware is a for-profit company. We routinely show all the code under a BSD license, and there are new models that are emerging. And I think it's important to really foster those and even demand that level of access.
Yeah, to ask for it, and then when it's not right, okay, it's not right, and that's it, And it doesn't feel very rewarding, does it? It's like, oh, guess what, you get nothing out of this now. But, at least something didn't go out there that wasn't true, or tried to hide something and was an advertisement for something that, we don't know.
Yeah, that was my ideological view of science when I got into it, because we all saw each other's work and we were all able to build on it. And it was very disappointing to realize that often wasn't the case. And I'm at least pleased to see that changing. But I think we still need to do a lot more work to get there and make that a thing that's expected rather than the exception right now.